Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Ellen Davis of Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this February 14th for some Valentine's Day session of the Oxford Interfaith Forum on Psalms. It's my enormous pleasure today to welcome and introduce Rabbi Or Rose, born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, educated in New York City, Jerusalem, and Boston. Rabbi Rose has for 15 years taught at Hebrew College in Boston. His research and writing focus on Jewish spirituality, interreligious engagement, and social justice. Among his publications are My Neighbor's Faith, Stories of Interreligious Encounter, Growth, and Transformation, and Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Essential Teachings, both of those from Orbis Books. In 2016, Rabbi Rose founded the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership of Hebrew College. As director of this center, his work is closely aligned with the central goal of this reading group, namely to equip religious leaders, including those still in training, to serve in a religiously diverse society through study and dialogue, and in the case of the Miller Center, through joint action. When I think of Rabbi Rose and the Psalms, the first thing that comes to my mind is his remarkable work of encouragement that emerged from the depths of the COVID crisis last year and in the midst of our ongoing racial crisis. Working with the Reverend Paul Raustenbusch of Interfaith Youth Corps, he offered a series of 18 weekly programs of poetry, song, meditations, dance, works of visual art from some 75 contributors in a wide range of traditions and disciplines. 18 is the numerical value of the Hebrew word chai, life. And over those 18 weeks, Psalm season reached 20,000 viewers with the Psalm's message of life lived consciously in the presence of God, in relationship with God, including times of troubled relationship with God. He is now working on creating a written commentary on the Psalms coming out of the Psalm Season project to be published later this year. A book is a wonderful medium, but a limited one in some ways. And so that points to the second major project on the Psalms that currently engages Rabbi Rose, namely creating an open access multimedia website for Jewish and Christian leaders and educators to teach and facilitate study and discussion of Psalms. Like Psalm Season, this website will give much attention to poetry, visual art, music, dance, and verbal arts such as translation. This is a collaborative effort with Dr. Andrew Davis of Boston College and is underwritten by the U.S. Catholic bishops. An interfaith project indeed. We are eager now to welcome you, Rabbi Rose, and to learn with you about Psalm 51 as heard through contemporary multi-faith interpretations.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I am honored and pleased to be with all of you. I am particularly honored by the generous and thoughtful introduction of one of my teachers, Dr. Ellen Davis. And it is also an honor for me to be in the presence of my first teachers of Torah, that being my mother and my father, Neil and Carol Rose from St. Louis, and so many other friends, colleagues, and teachers. Before I start my presentation, I want to call on the two readers that will open our session today. David, if you would, the reading in English, which will be followed by the reading in Hebrew by Elizabeth.
Psalm 51. For the leader, a psalm of David. When Nathan the prophet came to him after he had come to Bathsheba. Have mercy upon me, O God, as befits your faithfulness. In keeping with your abundant compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly of my iniquity, and purify me of my sin. For I recognize my transgressions, and am ever conscious of my sin. Against you alone have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight. So you are just in your sentence, and right in your judgment. Indeed, I was born with iniquity. With sin, my mother conceived me. Indeed, you desire truth about that which is hidden. Teach me wisdom about secret things. Purge me with hyssop till I am pure. Wash me till I am whiter than snow. Let me hear tidings of joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed exult. Hide your face from my sins. Blot out all my iniquities. Fashion a pure heart for me, O God. Create in me a steadfast spirit. Do not cast me out of your presence, or take your Holy Spirit away from me. Let me again rejoice in your help. Let a vigorous spirit sustain me. I will teach transgressors your ways, that sinners may return to you. Save me from blood guilt, O God, my deliverer, that I may sing forth your beneficence. O Lord, open my lips, and let my mouth declare your praise. You do not want me to bring sacrifices. You do not desire burnt offerings. True sacrifice to God is a contrite spirit. God, you will not despise a contrite and crushed heart. May it please you to make Zion prosper. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will want sacrifices offered in righteousness, burnt and whole offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar.
These texts, of course, were intended to be performed in different moments of one's life journey, both individually and communally. Before I start with my analysis of Psalm 51, I want to share a prefatory remark about how I arrived at my love affair on Valentine's Day with the Book of Psalms. Of course, as a child that grew up in a traditional Jewish home, attending Jewish day school, Jewish summer camps, etc., as a praying Jewish person, the Psalms were ubiquitous in my Jewish religious life, particularly in my liturgical life. But one impetus to focus my teaching and research and popular religious writing on Sefer Tehillim was occasioned by the death of my teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory. And here I want to share my screen and share with you the beginning of my slide presentation. I bring Reb Zalman's name and presence to bear because he was a person that understood quite early in terms of the North American interreligious grassroots movement, the power of the Psalms as a source for bridge building in the post-Second World War, post-Shoah era. In the middle of the slide, you see, of course, the mature Reb Zalman, who on the occasion of meeting with the Dalai Lama was dressed in his own Hasidic regalia from his younger years. And you see the beautiful faces of these two wizened elders, which to me, of course, is an immediate sign that they are playful enough to be called wizened elders. But beneath that picture, you see a much younger Reb Zalman. And he started his interreligious journey quite idiosyncratically, long before he was an international interfaith jet setter. It began in some sense under the tutelage of the great African-American religious teacher, preacher, and activist, the Reverend Howard Thurman. Upon first meeting Thurman in 1955, when Zalman enrolled as a graduate student at Boston University's School of Theology, he was looking for a place to pray, a place to daven. And he decided with some chutzpah and some nervousness that since there were no other buildings open at 6 o'clock in the morning, that he was going to step across the threshold of Marsh Chapel, the big chapel at the center of the campus. And seeing stained glass windows and other works of art of Jesus and the evangelists in the main chapel and a big brass cross in the smaller chapel, this daring but still hesitant chassid decided that he was going to pray in the Marsh memorabilia room, which was a neutral site. Thurman came upon the young chassid and very gently said to him, without introducing himself, without explaining that he was the great Howard Thurman, simply saying, perhaps if you come back tomorrow, we can find a more appropriate place for you to pray. Reb Zalman said that he was scared and wasn't sure how to respond to this unassuming and kind man about the religious quandary that he had about praying in these thickly Christian spaces with iconography. And so the next day he returns, and lo and behold, Thurman ushers him into the small chapel in the basement of Marsh. And there, as you see on the right, he finds 2 candles burning, no sign of the big brass cross, and the large ornate Tanakh turned to Psalm 139, whither shall I flee from thy presence, which happened to be Thurman's favorite psalm. Reb Zalman, still green in terms of his interfaith engagements, was nonetheless agile enough to understand that this was a very beautiful gesture of hospitality. And when he finished praying that morning, returned the cross to its place, since this was a Christian house of worship, blew out the candles, and turned the ornate Bible to Psalm 100. Mizmor LeTodah, a thank you song. That experience for Reb Zalman became the beginning of a lifelong journey. And for me, it is such a powerful model of the potential use of the shared texts, which we sometimes interpret similarly and sometimes differently. But the power of text to serve as a bridge when handled tenderly and thoughtfully is something that I think is a real model for all of us and serves as a model for my teaching. Reb Zalman went on to become an interreligious pioneer, dedicated activist. And one of the things he loved most to do with his beloved friend, Thomas Merton, if Thurman was his Rebbe, you might say Merton was his Chavrusa, was to visit him at Gethsemane occasionally, sit in the back of the chapel and listen to the monks chant the Psalms, and then privately to exchange this chanting in Hebrew and in Latin, face to face, panim el panim, with his beloved friend. So I want to bring that to our consciousness because it has stoked so much of the work that I've done over the years, including Psalm season, as Ellen described, and several courses over the last years that I've co-taught. I've had the blessing to co-teach with Andrew Davis of Boston College, with students from both of our schools and from the wider Boston Theological Institute network. What I'd like to do today is share with you a pedagogic approach to how I've been teaching Psalm 51, and to make sure that we're beginning on a level playing field, as we do in our courses and other contexts, a few notes about Psalm 51 structurally. The superscription, of course, is very important. It's important because it invites us to imagine this act of contrition, which is a very important word, as Dr. Davis knows, for her own work on Psalm 51. And it's placed in the mouth of David, and it's contextualized when the prophet Nathan exposes David's violation of Bathsheba and of Uriah. And the superscription is a later addition, but it's a brilliant addition in terms of the reception history of the psalm. And one of the questions that I regularly ask my students vis-a-vis the superscription is, if in the pre-modern era, clergy and scholars insisted after the close of the Bible that David was either the author of many or all of the Psalms, and then in the modern period, scholars and clergy insisted that David was the author of next to none of the Psalms, what do we as postmoderns do poetically, literarily, spiritually with this superscription, and how might it serve us in our own search for healing and for reconciliation? And we'll come back to that. Structurally, as some of you know, the psalm breaks into two halves, two strophes. The first half is marked by the repetition of these verbs of blotting out, of washing, of purging. And the second is heart, God, and spirit, the movement to reconciliation, to renewal. Wash, purify, blot out are specific references. You can see similar use of such terms as they relate to sin and forgiveness in the book of Isaiah. And then the last two lines, of course, have interested scholars and readers for centuries. They seem to be a later addition. They relate, of course, to Psalm 50, which opens this book within the 5 books of the Psalms. That too was a deft move of editing, of reception, so that righteous judgment and right sacrifice are themes that we find in both. And then within the Jewish tradition, the psalm is used far less than in the Christian tradition, interestingly. If I had my druthers, I would use it more and instruct others to use it more during Elul, leading up to and including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I think in some ways it's a more appropriate psalm than Psalm 27, but that's for another conversation. But it is used in some communities on Yom Kippur and on the Shabbat of Pesach. And of course, the words Adonai Sfatai Tiftach are ones that most Jews know. I would say that even most learned Jews don't associate it necessarily with this psalm, but it serves as the introduction, the hushed introduction to the Amidah, the central standing prayer that we say 3 times daily. And then you see, and many of you are familiar with the more extensive use of this psalm within the penitential psalms in Christian contexts. Here is a kind of roadmap that I want to share with you, that I want to workshop with you. These are the common questions that I've been trying to articulate at the beginning, the middle, and the end of every session with students. And in red, you see the kind of pedagogic notes that I want to share with you as practitioners, educators, and scholars. Which words, phrases, or images in Psalm 51 are most striking to you, and why? Part of what my hope is that when working with students, that there'll be a cultivation of the poetic imagination. These are poems that were performed. And so drawing people's attention to words, to phrases, to images matters. The second question is about this intertextual introduction, the superscription. how might it help us? What is the text and the context of the original sources? And what is the play that is already present within the biblical canon? And how does that serve as a model for Jewish and Christian exegesis that follows for centuries? The third question is, what does return or reconciliation look like in your religious traditions and in your life? That is to say, moving from the texts to religious life, right? What does one have to say about the major religious themes across our traditions? The next question is about sin or missing the mark, right? Which is a better translation of the word chet in Hebrew, right? What are the images that are operative in your religious imagination? And if I dare ask, are they helpful? Are they still helpful? Right? So that there's some personal investment in it, not just historical, textual, liturgical, poetic, but personal. And then turning to the text and context of today. Over the last 2 years, we've lived through a variety of different events, so much of which have been terribly painful. And I believe that the Book of Psalms are an important work for such a time. So text and context today. And then lastly, mirroring the first question, how do we cultivate the pedagogic imagination? If you were to facilitate a study session of this text with Jewish, Christian, or an interreligious group, what would you want participants to leave knowing, and more importantly, asking? So that's a kind of brief roadmap. And I want to instantiate that now with a variety of resources, mostly contemporary, but in conversation with classical commentaries and lesser known commentaries to show you how this is operationalized, imperfectly, of course, but here is a sharing. To begin with, the superscription, right? To understand that there is an intentional play here linguistically with the word bo. That has to do with entering a space, and then of course it's a euphemism for sexual penetration. And you see Richard Levy's simple statement that this is a psalm which is a powerful account of a sinning person's remorse. It could be any person, it could be David, it could be fill in the blanks. To the right, of course, you see this classic work by Angelika Kaufman. And then I want you to pay attention to the interplay between these three with this commentary from Moshe Alshech, a great mystical commentary, a song of David, Mizmor LeDavid. So he's actually commenting right on the opening, not on verse 2. He composed the present psalm out of gratitude. So this is a psalm of gratitude. Why? For the prophet reproached him privately rather than publicly. When Nathan the prophet came to him, Alshech insists, him alone, not to anyone else. Then look at the painting, right? Who is present and who is not present. In many other works of art, Bathsheba is present, usually somewhere on the periphery. In some works of art, Uriah's body is actually present. So I raise this because I think when it comes to the question of tochecha, since I'm mostly working with religious leaders in training or in the field, one of the questions, particularly in this day and age, of calling in or calling out, hocheach tochiach, rebuke, you shall surely rebuke, is understood as a mitzvah, as a sacred deed in our tradition. But how does one go about doing that? What are the appropriate ways in which to do that? And there's much in rabbinic literature about the ways in which we falter in giving and receiving tochacha. It is an art. So I just bring that to your attention, especially, with this painting, because to see the words, but then to see the image of who is present and who is not, I think is powerful as a kind of opening, evocative statement about our responsibilities in these situations of sin, of judgment, of forgiveness, of healing. Of course, for any of us to enter into a process of honest and true tshuva, to quote Buber, we have to answer the question, ayeka, where are you? And as Buber so beautifully says, paraphrasing the Ropshitzer Rebbe, 19th century Hasidic master, God is not asking a geographical location question. Ayeka, where are you? What are you hiding from? And do you dare come out from your network of hideouts? And our teacher, Ellen, who is with us, talks about contrition in her wonderful essay in the book, Getting Involved with God, where she comments, rightly so, I think, that contrition is understood too often in our context as an outmoded concept. We don't want to be overly guilt-ridden. But what does it mean to actually let your heart break and then offer the pieces to God? And I would agree, Ellen, it is a radically countercultural notion to allow oneself to fully embrace what he or she has done wrong, and then to offer it as a sacrifice, playing with the language, which of course I know that you are doing, in the psalm itself. And if we believe that we are created in the image of the divine, part of offering a sacrifice, of course, is offering back to God the one unique thing that we can offer God, which is the heart that God has given us, but now broken, asking for God to help us in the mending process. Part of the experience of learning and teaching interreligiously, of course, is thinking about notions of God, of theology, inherited notions of self and other, and the ways in which oftentimes these can be harshly polemical. And here's an example. We believe that God is a God of mercy. And out of God's mercy, God will re-embrace the penitent. So here is a piece that I think is quite beautiful, right? Nothing is more characteristic of a Christian than mercy. There's nothing that unbelievers and all people are so amazed at when we are merciful. For we ourselves are often in need of this mercy and say to God, have mercy on us according to the greatness of your mercy. The sentiment to me is beautiful. Let us begin first ourselves, yet we do not begin first. For he has already shown his mercy that he has towards us. But beloved, let us follow second. To me, what rings in my ears, of course, is the language of the great 20th century theologian and activist, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, that God is in search of humankind. That when we feel that twinge of spirituality, so to speak, it's already a response to a call from the God who is merciful, the God of pathos. And I fully embrace that and accept it. What's painful, of course, is that, right, this commentator feels the need to say unbelievers and all people. And of course, included there, chief among those people are Jews. And so we turn to the Amidah, Adonai Svatai Tiftach, right? That same Amidah. And one of the prayers written before this period, but in the same milieu, of course, is Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu, mechal lanu ki fashanu, ki mochel v'soleach ata baruch ata Adonai chanun choneni chanun hamarbeh, right, which figures prominently in the psalm as it relates to the hyssop, the abundant mercy, the washing, the sloach. And so this is an opportunity, right, in terms of text and context, also to offer a corrective about the polemics across our traditions. Here's a piece that I think is powerful, and it comes out of teaching and learning and from the psalm season, from a friend, a colleague, and a student, which I want to keep in mind. David Mayan asks, while David expresses deep remorse for his sins and desperately seeks forgiveness from God, we never find that David sought to heal the wounds that he had caused Bathsheba, Uriah, or the violation of the public trust involved in sending Uriah together with other loyal troops into a deliberate suicide mission for David's own perceived private gain. And then he goes on to say, I think as a powerful challenge to the inherited, often apologetic readings of King David, when viewed from this perspective, David's initial declaration to God in Psalm 51 that against you alone I have sinned is highly problematic. Of course, that we can voice these criticisms and raise disturbing questions is also a testimony to the Bible's blunt and stark presentation of the whole affair. And then he says powerfully, the Bible allows, or better demands, that we come to these stories with our imagination and our moral sensibilities. I just want to add, one of the powerful things that Ellen discusses in her essay is that we do injure God, that this is an injury of a God who makes God's self vulnerable if God is involved in a loving relationship with humankind. So that is true. So you might say the vertical and the horizontal intersect. But I think David's point is still an important one. Is it to God alone? What about the other people that are involved in this? And what are the ways in which we can learn from it? And what is an appropriate means to seeking out forgiveness? And then, of course, we come to verse 7, which has been a source of controversy for Jews and Christians because of the question of original sin. And you see St. Augustine's very helpful summation of what you might describe as a classical position on original sin from Adam onwards. And then here is Robert Alter, whose commentary I find very helpful. There are times, however, where I find that he's also overly polemical, if I may say so, in my judgment. And he rightly points out that there are both Christian and Jewish commentators, not only early Jewish, but later Jewish as well, who understand this as pointing to original sin, right? And the verse related to the heat of the sexual encounter, which is almost always used exclusively with animals too, elsewhere in the Tanakh, right, is one of those. But right then he says there's not much here to support the idea that this is the case of every human born. And I understand that from his historical critical perspective. But I just want to say something personal. When I read in advance of this session, Ellen's more personal reflection on this piece, informed, of course, by decades of scholarship, I asked myself, to what extent am I willing to entertain, right, this notion of original sin? Because I'm so defensive oftentimes, just given the histories of our traditions. But when she writes, we are born compromised, the slate is never blank before any of us by reason of race, gender, social location, or particular parentage, right, etc. We were, you might say, set up to hurt others and to be hurt by them. And then when we think about what we inherit from our parents and from our environment, right, both personally, communally, and then importantly, very importantly, nationally, to what extent do we say we are born in sin? Or at least, as she says, the propensity for sin, right? As many rabbinic writers would say, you know, with sin crouching at the door, paraphrasing the early chapters of Genesis as it relates, right, to Cain and Abel. So I just ask myself and my students, to what extent are we defensive? And does it matter who says it and how they say it? Right? And I think it does. You know, part of it is a relational openness, given in this case that Ellen is a teacher and someone that I respect and know, someone I would describe as an Ohevet Israel, someone that really has love for the community of Israel. And here's a beautiful and original piece of artwork. Again, part of what I'm trying to communicate in my teaching is that these commentaries are as valuable as any other sort. And we give preference oftentimes to the written word, but what about other forms of interpretation? And here you see that actually John Bergmeyer is saying something that complements Ellen's case, right? The image of the heart is in part connected with my recent physical health, but also the past health of my father. And if you look carefully, the rotary phone and the map and the symbols about intergenerational pain, not only physical, but the rest. What does it have to do with our understanding of ourselves and being embedded, right, in the behaviors that are both growthful, kind, generous, just, but also those that are negative? And here we come to the hyssop, right, and the power of ritual. This is a very important piece for me because not only does it reach back to other rituals in the Tanakh, so it's an opportunity to explore those, but also to ask the question, what does ritual look like vis-a-vis sin and contrition in our own lives? One of my students that's a chaplain said that she often reads this verse with people that are dying. And one of the things that she's come to do is actually to bring a few hyssop branches with her into this pastoral setting because people are so in need of opportunities to ritualize their contrition. And so how might that play out in our own rabbinates, ministries, and callings? Here is a contemporary piece on hyssop and immersion. And it just kind of took my breath away because you feel the sense here of this individual and this woman, of course, with the shocking blue hair, but otherwise immersed, right, in the white mixture, right? So it brings to mind, of course, immersion or baptism, but also the dream, the hope, the yearning of being cleansed, like the snow that falls in the Galilee and in the north and center of the land of Israel. I want to share with you two more pieces. There's a lot more, but one of them is by someone who's on our call, my student and friend, Rafi Ellenson, who very bravely took on the challenge of asking the question, what does it mean for me as a person that suffers from mental illness to feel as if I've been cast out by God? Not because I have sinned, but because my brain chemistry leads me to a place of great loneliness and pain and isolation. And then how do we read that psalm in light of such experiences? What does it mean to cry out for the Holy Spirit? And what do we do when we can't find that? You know, and Rafi writes here quite beautifully about finding companionship with the patriarch Jacob. When that ruach disappeared from him, right, according to rabbinic sources, after Yosef, his beloved son, was taken from him. And then the questions continue. We move from the deeply personal to the communal, to the national. What does it mean to take responsibility, as another of my students asked, in the midst of the racial reckoning in this country? And so Tom Reed, who's now Reverend Tom Reed, writes, the founders of the United States, for example, were deeply flawed human beings, just like each of us. The origins of this country include a bold liberatory vision, but also the unconscionable trafficking of human beings and the horrors of slave labor. So what does that mean about inherited sin, to go back to Ellen's comment, to being embedded in family and community and doing so nationally? And we intentionally placed on this slide this piece of artwork because you see all of the indigenous influences in it. The colors, the style, create a clean heart. And the specific piece that Tom had in mind was this. This is when he wrote that piece for Psalm season. So what do we do with that? How do we understand the influence and the possibilities for reconciliation given the moment in which we find ourselves? And what are our responsibilities? I want to play for you just a short piece that came out of this exploration. in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of the racial reckoning by two students. Leah was the intern on this project, and her husband, as you'll see, plays multiple instruments. And taking in all of this, they came up with this beautiful original piece of music.
ברוח קודשך תיקח ממני, אל תשליכני מלפניך, אל תשליכני מלפניך, אל תשליכני מלפניך, ברוח קודשך תיקח ממני, השיבה לי ששון אישך, ברוח נדיבה תשמחני, השיבה לי ששון אישך, ברוח נדיבה תשמחני.
So I bring that simply as an example of the creative possibilities when we engage with an understanding that the people that we are teaching are also, of course, themselves both inheritors and innovators, and inviting people into this ongoing creative process. The very last thing I'll say is just to share with you an example of a contemporary piece of poetry. And I find it fascinating for a number of reasons. It's written by a doctor and someone that's fluent in Hebrew, who actually did a translation of Adin Steinsaltz's commentary on the Book of Psalms, Guy Aronoff Bernstein. And one of the things that she chooses to do is not to include the superscription, right? So just to think about that, you know, what's gained and what's lost in translation. And then she just has a number of interesting choices here that are indicative of a close reading. I just want to point to one, which is, I see sins in my mirror, which in talking to her is her interpretation of len negdi, that my sins are always before me, but they're not internalized. They sit before me, across from me. And then she imagines the broken mirror like the broken heart. So with that, I will close. It's a little bit of a quick tour through a variety of resources, but what I often do at the end of these sessions with students, as I said before, is return to the opening questions. So now that you've had the opportunity over the course of 2 or 3 hours in a class setting to go through these materials, right, in chavruta, in small groups, in large groups, where do these questions stand? And what will you take with you? So thank you very much for letting me share what is very much a work in progress, but an exciting part for me of, you know, the pedagogy of teaching interreligiously Psalm 51.
Thank you so much, or Rabbi Rose, for taking us so deeply into this text. We have just over 10 minutes for conversation, and I'm going to take 1 minute of that time to claim the privilege of answering your first question, which is, which word or phrase stands out for me, the image. And as I listened to the reading, actually the first reading in English, I was struck by the rendering of the Hebrew phrase in verse 14, V'ruach nediva tismacheni, is rendered, I had not noticed it before, in the new JPS as let a vigorous spirit sustain me. I translated that in the translation I'm doing of this psalm. I had translated it a generous spirit, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about that at some later time, not today. But thinking about that notion of a vigorous spirit, I was struck by the way that you used Chrysostom, someone who, as you pointed out, was not a generous spirit toward Jews or people who were not, as he judged them, his co-religionists. But you took him not at his weakest point from our perspective, but his strong point.
Yes.
In a way that was both honest and generous. I would call that a ruach nediva in multiple ways. And likewise, in the way you engaged my own thinking, taking a notion that is not necessarily an attractive one to your tradition, at least, and thinking, what could it mean to you? You spoke at the very beginning about the power of a text to serve as a bridge when it is handled tenderly and thoughtfully. I believe you were speaking about your own teacher at that point. And it seems to me that that's what you've done in this past hour. And you have given us an example of the art of tochacha, the art, in a sense, the art of reproving, because I think this kind of interfaith dialogue always has in it it sets limits to the places where we can agree, and there's an element of reproof for the way, especially speaking from my own tradition, Christians need to be reproved for our inability to engage respectfully with Jews and others in our reading of these texts. So thank you for that, modeling that art for us. And now I would invite you to raise your hands. You can raise them manually, but if you raise them electronically, you pop up to the top of the screen, which helps. And also to enter questions into the chat if you wish to do that. I see we have a comment in the chat, but not a question. Does someone wish to begin? Yes, Joanna Murdoch.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm a little bit of an interloper here, but this was a fantastic and really rich session to attend, and really relevant for my current research on medieval English paraphrases of the penitential Psalms. So I wanted to ask, since I'm so ignorant about Jewish traditions, about the sort of let's see, how can I say this? In medieval Christian penitential practice, there were these 3 stages of penance, and a lot of attention went to, have you completed the stages in the right way? So I'm curious about, in this psalm and its reception, in the traditions you represent, are there sort of boundaries in it? Do you sort of complete something and then you're able to receive all the good stuff? Or are these states of relationship to God and to other humans existing sort of layered at the same time? Just wondering if you could comment on that a bit.
So I'll say a brief word and then invite others there that are people that certainly have knowledge and experience working with this text that may have some additional comments. In my experience working with this text, it is so seldom used in regular Jewish ritual that I don't find in my community or the communities that I've participated in that it's become a developed ritual in ways that others function in terms of choreography and such. Adonai Sfatai Tiftach, right? I often open with and a musical setting to it because I want to point out, especially to Jews, that is nested within this psalm, because most praying Jews have no clue about that, even though praying Jews will say those words 3 times a day. And then it is used, as a whole piece on Yom Kippur and on the Shabbat of Pesach. but it isn't mapped in that same kind of way that you're describing. I think one piece that struck me again from Ellen's essay, which is fresh in my mind, and it's not simply because she's the moderator, because it's an eloquent and powerful essay, is she says, how do you know that you are not involved, in deception, right? Which we are so prone to. That's, Buber's point. How do you know that you're engaged in a genuine process, of asking for forgiveness and reconciling with God? And she says, perhaps one of the clues is that when you can actually pray again to God and with God, right? That you understand that God is present to you, right? However subtle, but that you're calling out, and at the same time, right, you feel that presence, right, within that psalm, right, calling out and then being present with God. And that to me is an interesting cue, at least something that I want to follow in my own use of the psalm moving forward. But it's an interesting question. I think a broader question about the efficacy of ritual and how we understand that and how that's been laid out for us.
Thank you.
Jeremy. Oh, sorry.
That's what I was going to say. So go ahead, Jeremy Ingpen.
We can't hear you.
You were muted.
There we go. While you were talking, I was looking at the Russian translation of 1862, which is Metropolitan Philaret. That one thing was interesting with the Slavonic and the Russian is they incorporate the heading, I forget what you call it, into the psalm, as opposed to Coverdale's translation from the Book of Common Prayer, which is the basis of your English translations. So comparing Coverdale to the Russian, where he has against thee, have I sinned, the Russian has in front of thee, before thee only have I sinned, which is a very interesting shift. And then on your comment on hyssop, when I was around the garden for our little church in Vermont, we had a pathway coming up to the church, and I had hyssop growing along the edge of the pathway with this idea that as you walked up, you would purge yourself with the hyssop and become clean. So a journey, which is a slightly different twist than the bathing that you had. And then just back to the Russian, cast me not away from your presence, which is what the Coverdale has. The Russian has, don't take me away from your face, which I think is very, very interesting. So, and it sort of relates to this comment on medieval translations. The translation is always an interpretation, and it's
Absolutely.
Very interesting to follow those.
Yes, absolutely. Each of these translations is an interpretive gesture. Ellen, I'm curious about Lecha Levadcha, because I referenced you in what I think is a very powerful kind of I-thou move in your essay about, all of these sins, of course, are sins against God. But then asking the question, as David Mayan did, but is saying Lecha Levadcha, to you alone, appropriate?
It's interesting. I am preaching on Psalm 51 for Ash Wednesday, so on March 2nd, a couple of weeks, and I've given some thought to that sermon. And I'm actually going to focus on that moment. I'm preaching to my own students who will, of course, know the superscription. And I think what I'm going to say about it is that this psalm represents that interpretation, because of course I take the superscription as being a first level of interpretation, which is already included in the canonical text. That reading of it is a particular moment at which everything else drops away except the way I have failed God. Eventually, I think the other parts have to come in. Right. And that's also a part of the work of return reconciliation of which you spoke. But there is that one moment at which it is only me before God. in my awareness.
Thank
And
you.
I don't think that's necessarily the first moment
Right.
in the process of return, but it is a moment.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's helpful. First of all, as a reminder, right, as I tried to say at the outset, there are these two early stages of interpretation. One is the superscription, and then the later one is placing it next to Psalm 50. Those are already, as I would say, deft interpretive moves.
Yes.
Before the rabbis and the church fathers, engage in that kind of interpretive play. But to think about it in terms of stages. And I would ask again, as I did at the outset, when and where is that superscription helpful, and when is it not? And I like the poem at the end very much, and it's an interesting choice by this contemporary poet. And she said to me, I just felt like that piece of the reception history got in the way of my own experience of the psalm and working with it, which I thought was very powerful. And she's a physician, and part of her experience was seeing people in waiting rooms, reading Time magazine or Newsweek, and feeling like she wanted to try and offer them something else more appropriate for such moments.
I watched a group of ballet dancers, contemporary dancers, interpret this psalm, and they were doing it in my classroom. And they began doing it with Lecha Levadcha, but before you, or toward you and only you. And then they said, someone in the class said, but now can you dance it in front of Batsheva?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that changed it completely.
Yes.
We are at time. Or did you want to say anything about the publication of the book or the website? Did you tell me beforehand?
Yes, I just want to call on my colleague, Wendy Linden, who's generous enough to be here. You see her beautiful pastoral background there with snow, who can just say a word about the website that we're developing. And some of you may want to contribute to either of these projects, but Wendy, have the last word.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. We are creating a website where it's almost like a psalm library / database, where you'll be able to choose by psalm, by media, meaning music, poetry, art, by theme, and by teaching tool, and sort and find lesson plans and other snippets of information about each psalm accessible quickly and through searching. I know we don't have time to share my screen right now, but we'll be happy to share the link once it becomes live. But we've taken the lesson plan that Or went through actually and created an online version, 2 versions actually, one that's sort of a deep dive into the Psalms and one that's a self-guided lesson. And Rafi Ellenson has helped put that together. So it should be a great resource, not just for those teaching about the Psalms, but for anybody looking for content and creative resources on particular Psalms and their themes. So.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Wendy and Rabbi Rose, both for putting together this resource and offering it to us. Immense thanks for what you have given us in this last hour. Rabbi Rose, it's been a real privilege to learn with you. And I invite all of you to be with us next month as we hear Dr. Erica Monge-Greer of the University of Oregon speak about Psalm 82 in a session that will be chaired by the Reverend Dr. John Golden Gay. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.